We live in an era of thoroughly documented history, of ancient civilizations and long-standing religions. But go far enough back in history, past the years measured by Jesus' life, long before the Roman calendar system, beyond the reaches of histories and annals, and you reach a frontier where historians must blindly grope and fit together pieces to reshape the story of humanity. Their models are frequently challenged and often revised, but without a time machine, many of their theories can only remain as theories. The closer they come to today, the more certain things become. As time passes, the origins of civilization come sharply into focus. While humanity spans thousands of years, the civilizations we know are much more recent. Unfortunately, with such a vague historical record, the settling of lands like Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, or China cannot be used with any exactness or practicality. Most of us have pinned the birth of Jesus, or something close to it, as the starting point of our calendar. But as both a Christian and as a history lover, this isn't the most practical starting point. As thrilling as his arrival was, and as monumental as it would be spiritually, it would be centuries before his impact would be felt on the civilizational scale. For anyone living then, the time during and after Jesus was mostly continuous with the time before it. Yet because we break history according to Jesus' birth, Christians see his arrival in a vacuum, rather than as someone actively engaging the currents of his time. And outside of Jesus, there was very little happening in the first years AD. Roman hegemony was established, Greek civilization had spread, and this says nothing of the developments outside Rome. For its part, modern Israel dates history according to the time of creation in the Hebrew Bible, but that number also reaches into the murky past and gets hotly disputed among both Christians and Jews today, to say nothing of secular historians. So, where do we draw the line? Where can we divide prehistory from modern history? Can we identify a point where things really kicked off? When the simple settlements across Eurasia blossomed into the titanic civilizations of the classical world, where humanity truly began cascading into the world we know today. Strangely enough, there is. As a matter of fact, there's a single century where all the development in the civilizations across Eurasia coalesced and set the stage for all that was to come. There is no single event or individual that set this in motion, so the only thing these developments have in common is when they happened. And yet, very bizarrely, all of them did happen around the same time, in roughly the same century. Not only that, but the three most important events in Western history all happened within the same decade. This is part of a time frame informally called the Axial Age, a term coined by the German philosopher Karl Jaspers. And although its significance is largely one of coincidence, it is one of jaw-dropping coincidences. The age he proposed spans several centuries, but just one century stands out above the rest. This is the Axial Century. China. In China, in 475 BC, the Zhou dynasty fell into terminal decline. Having stood since 1066 BC, the dynasty had grown impotent and helpless, as 7 warring factions erupted in a bitter cutthroat conflict called the Warring States period. Civil warfare was lost, as the competition grew vicious and increasingly destructive. Huge armies in excess of 250,000 men were hurled against each other, and tactics rapidly evolved. Not surprisingly, the 5th century saw the circulation of The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Strangely, against this backdrop of war came such a wide array of Chinese philosophy that they were collectively called the 100 Schools of Thought. Broadly, these schools fell into 3 tracks: Confucianism, Taoism, and Legalism. Confucius lived from 550 to 479 BC, and he taught a philosophy of self-cultivation, moral improvement, and virtue. Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, comes soon after in the 4th century BC and teaches a philosophy seeking harmony with nature and the Tao. Mozi, alive between 480 and 390 BC, formed Moism, a philosophy of nonviolence. Legalism emerged at this time too to counter human evil with codes and laws. A host of other philosophies and philosophers would emerge, but when the Qin dynasty emerged in 225 BC, it would harness legalism to bind the First Empire of China together. Moism and many of the old philosophies would be repressed, but Confucianism and Taoism, like legalism, would persist to today. The Qin dynasty, for its part, would set in motion construction on the Great Wall of China, although it would quickly be replaced by the more famous Han dynasty. Nevertheless, the imperial systems that the Qin built would be reinforced by the Han and stand until the 20th century. India. Across the Himalayas from 1700 to 600 BC, India was seeing massive waves of migration. Urban civilization along the Indus River Valley had collapsed, and large populations were migrating into the Indo-Gangetic Plain to the Ganges River. This was the Vedic Age, a period known through the Vedas, the sacred texts composed during this time. I say composed but not written because they weren't actually written here. Rather, they were passed down orally for over 1,000 years before finally being inscribed by 500 BC, ultimately bound with the final layers to be added, the Upanishads. But the Vedas are the core texts of Hinduism, and they remain essential for Indian culture today. The turning point came in the 6th century as Indian civilization again urbanized and small nations emerged. The Vedas were preeminent, together with the Varnas class hierarchy and the Brahmin priests at the top of that hierarchy. By the 6th century, then, Indian civilization became caught up in dialogue with this status. Orthodox forms of Hinduism embraced and appealed to the Vedas to legitimize their messages. In turn, radicals like the Buddha and Mahavira rejected the authority of the Vedas, or the Brahmins. They, the founders of Buddhism and Jainism in the 6th century, were among the handful of philosophers to buck the system. Even early forms of materialism and skepticism were beginning to take shape in India. The period would ultimately be brought to an end with the sudden arrival of Alexander, who conquered a large stretch of the subcontinent before dying in Babylon. This would bring about the ascension of Chandragupta Maurya and the Mauryan Empire in 321 BC, which would become the first empire to unite India. This empire would reach its height with its third ruler, Ashoka, who would promote Buddhism to pacify his realm. The West. Into the far west of India, the world wasn't merely transitioning, it was being completely rewritten. The foundations of the Western world weren't just forming within the same time period, but 3 of the most important moments in Western civilization would happen within a decade of each other. In the Levant, the 2 great civilizations of the Fertile Crescent had been dueling for centuries. Since the ascension of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the kingdoms of Mesopotamia and Egypt had thrown themselves into a titanic clash, as first the Assyrians, then the Babylonians fought to subdue Egypt. Prior to this point, the ancient Near East had been defined by kingdoms, wars, and technologies that were growing in size. In a matter of centuries, the lands of Egypt and Mesopotamia had gone from scattered, bickering city-states to united civilizations hurling armies against each other at an unprecedented scale. Any observer then might be forgiven for expecting these 2 lands to dominate the world forever, or at least to stand as long as China, India, or Iran have. And yet, like the Muslim conquests of Byzantium and Parthia, the Achaemenid Empire would flip the table over and smash the weakened players to pieces. In 28 short years, both lands would be so totally subdued that they would never again stand as world superpowers. In fact, aside from brief moments of independence, these lands would remain vassals of foreign rulers and greater powers until today. In 550 BC, Cyrus II took on the Median Empire and defeated it. In 542, Cyrus subdued the Lydian kingdom in western Anatolia. In 539, Cyrus realized his crowning achievement, the conquest of Babylon and Mesopotamia. Cyrus would also lead successful campaigns as far as India. When Cyrus died on campaign in 530, his son Cambyses II took command, and in 525 would conquer Egypt, even extending control over Nubia and Libya. Cambyses died in 522, and when Darius the Great took the throne that year, he ruled over the greatest empire ever formed to that point. This was before the Qin, the first empire in China, and before the Maurya, the first empire in India. Cyrus would inspire Alexander, who in turn would inspire Greeks and Romans like Julius Caesar. The Persian Empire would prove to be the first of many great empires to come. After the coming of Alexander, there has hardly been a time when some European power didn't control land beyond Egypt. Darius immediately set to work redrawing the internal map of Persia, reshaping political realities that had existed for hundreds of years. He would initiate a series of reforms, including the implementation of the satrapy system over his vast domain. He would stomp out rebellions in Babylon, Egypt, and elsewhere, reaffirming control over the territories of his 2 predecessors, while pushing the empire further outward. Some traditions show Darius interacting with Zarathustra, who himself has often been dated to this period as being a contemporary of Persia's early kings. Zoroastrianism would become the imperial religion and expand its influence widely, even as Persian rulers tolerated and embraced the religions of their subordinates. But it would be in Persia's west that by sheer coincidence, 3 of the most foundational moments in Western civilization would happen. Although he could not have known it, Darius's ascension would soon be followed by the greatest decade in the greatest century of human history. In Greece, the reigning order of Athens was shaken when one of the sons of the ruling king was assassinated. The resulting martyrdom of the assassins sparked a civil war that toppled the monarchy and thrust the surviving prince into exile. By 508 BC, the dust had settled and an absolute democracy involving all the adult males of Athens had emerged. Although the time of the 7 sages of Athens in the 6th century had just passed, the city was on the precipice of its famed Golden Age, an era that produced its most famed playwrights and philosophers. Starting with the Ionian school, pre-Socratic philosophy would flourish in Greece, even as Greek plays were forming as an artistic medium. In 499 BC, Darius and the Persians would cross the Hellespont, igniting the famed Greco-Persian Wars. Less than 2 centuries later, in 334 BC, a Greek army would be led in the opposite direction, toppling the Persian Empire, planting Greek kingdoms, and spreading Hellenism throughout the Mediterranean and the former lands of the Achaemenids. Meanwhile, in 509 BC, a year before Athens established its democracy, something had stirred well to the west of Greece. The aristocrats of Rome had been scandalized by the son of Rome's 7th king, who had defiled the noblewoman Lucretia. Outrage spurred revolution, and before long Rome's aristocrats had toppled the monarchy. A pair of consuls were installed in an office that rotated annually among the aristocratic patricians. Sensing an opportunity, the common plebeians staged a strike until they were included among the new assembly, and a role was formed to represent them. The tribune of the plebs, the res publica, or the Roman Republic, had been born. Following its ascension in Italy, Rome would contend with Carthage in the Punic Wars, and from there it would ascend to dominate the Mediterranean, swallowing Greece and the Greek kingdoms established after Alexander. But the republican system was the casualty of the power plays of its greatest men, and the Roman Empire would be born. The rest, as they say, is history. If it can be said that 508 saw democracy emerge in Athens, and that 509 saw republicanism emerge in Rome, what could rival these? What third event could have happened on par with Rome and Athens within 10 years of either? That would have come in 516 BC. 23 years prior, shortly after Cyrus had conquered Babylon, he had issued a series of decrees meant to cultivate the goodwill of his new subjects. Cyrus encouraged varied religious expression throughout his empire and issued a decree that a small temple in a little province in southern Levant should be rebuilt. Eagerly, the former inhabitants of that land, including the grandson of the deposed king, rushed back and set to work rebuilding their temple in their capital city. This grandson was Zerubbabel, descendant of King David, and the city, of course, was Jerusalem. The last of the great Jewish prophets hailed Zerubbabel's arrival, proclaiming him, the new high priest Jeshua, and Cyrus all to be messiahs. The story of the Hebrew Bible was drawing to a close. The Jews had emerged from Babylon much as Israel had once emerged from Egypt. Now, unlike then, they had far more than the law of Moses. Now they had a complete history of Israel and the writings of the prophets from the preceding centuries. The Hebrew Bible wasn't yet assembled. The final prophetic books were still being written. But the core, the law and the prophets, were there. Then, right as everything seemed perfect, some jealous rivals blocked the plans. Because when the governors around Judea heard of these efforts, they sabotaged them, and construction ground to a halt. But in 522, Darius came to power. Zerubbabel resumed work on the temple, and when the regional governors tried to retaliate, Darius's advisors recovered the decree issued by Cyrus. The king endorsed the work of the Jews, and by the 6th year of his reign, 516 BC, the Second Temple had been completed. It's hard to overstate how monumental this was. The revolutions in Rome and Greece are well known. The Roman Republic would give way to the Roman Empire, producing great men and conquerors who would shape the political landscape of Europe and inspire legions of imitators in the millennia between then and today. Athens, and Greece more broadly, would birth the philosophical, mathematical, and cultural milieu of the Mediterranean and the West, starting conversations that we are still participating in. But although the revolution of the Second Temple era receives far less attention, it has gone on to shape the religious and moral landscape of the West. It was in the Second Temple period that the final books of the Hebrew Bible were written. Those final books in turn would inspire dozens of literary imitators, rewriting or expanding on the Bible, exploring apocalyptic visions, and telling of special people or special events in the history of Judea. It saw the rise of the synagogue, the emergence of angelology, discussions of evil spirits, fears around Satan, discussions on life after death, questions of the law, and hopes for a new Messiah. As revolutionary as Jesus or Paul were, they were entering into and engaging with a vibrant, hotly contested world of the Second Temple Judaism. They shared the same traditions and spoke the same intellectual language. Christians start history with the launch of the church, but the church didn't arrive in a void. And in neglecting the age of the Second Temple, Christians missed the soil on which the seeds were planted. Without the Second Temple period, none of the Abrahamic faiths, with all their billions of adherents, would ever have formed. In the Oxford Handbook on Levantine Archaeology, Dr. Gunnar Lehmann notes, "The Persian or Achaemenid period is a time of such profound changes that this epoch is also known as the Axial Age. During the Persian period, new political elites emerged, as well as new religious and economic ones. The world was growing together. The Mediterranean was increasingly interacting with the Near East. Authoritative religious texts were composed, among them the Bible. The foundations of philosophy and science were laid. A new vision of man and humanity was forged. Darius the Great could not have possibly known what a marvelous decade he presided over. With revolutions spanning from China to India to Europe and the Near East, he could not have known that thousands of years of history were concluding in his reign, and a new, millennia-spanning age was about to begin.